Okay, he's in an early stage, so we can shoot him. So.
Okay. So my name is Dan, and I'm going to present my 3 pages paper on tacit architectural knowledge. I will start with one line sentence, which is about, okay, what is the purpose of this research? So the statement is that no one really understands the role of the architect's experience in the architecting processes. And I'm going to study that. The presentation will be structured with those chapters in the footer. There are some definitions of architectural knowledge which were identified by Fahrenhorst and de Boer in a systematic literature review on the architecting literature. Some of the most widely encountered definitions are design decisions plus design. Also, a sharp workshop resulted in a definition of architectural knowledge as integrated representation of decisions and other factors. However, these definitions I consider are a bit problematic because design decisions and design can also be regarded as a result of cognitive process, of knowledge processes, while the Sharp definition can also be considered as a definition of architectural information instead of knowledge. So basically the issue is that knowledge is a very difficult concept which has been keeping philosophers busy for more than 2,000 years. So, to somehow recognize that, the definition that I am thinking on using is architectural knowledge is knowledge about software architecture. To understand what knowledge is, there is an interesting metaphor of knowledge as an iceberg. So the explicit knowledge will be on the surface, it's more visible. You would have documents, wikis, other sorts of artifacts that you store in a database, while the tacit knowledge is, you would have knowledge that hasn't been recorded, or maybe it's too expensive to record it, or everyone knows it, so it will never get recorded in the documentation. Or there is even knowledge that individuals don't have, but groups do. And also there is a more extreme perspective of tacit knowledge that cannot be recorded. In the knowledge management literature, there is the so-called SECI model from socialization, externalization, combination, and internalization. Basically, these describe a series of conversions. For example, tacit knowledge is converted to tacit knowledge through the process of socialization. An example of this is the relationship of master and apprentice. So basically, you look at the master and you learn from him or her. Externalization is about making knowledge explicit, while the opposite process is internalization. You have the explicit knowledge and you internalize it, you understand it, you make it part of your experience. In an organization, basically there is this spiral, and by moving on this spiral, more and more knowledge is created in an organization. Another interesting model is the tacit knowledge codification cycle from Bush. He's saying that initially there is tacit knowledge that is acquired, and then it gradually gets more and more solidified, and then it moves to an initial codification phase, which, for example, you'd have documents which are drafts, which are still work in progress. And at some point, it becomes information fully codified. And let's say at the end of some project, you might even you have this fully codified information which you can keep. Also in the software architecture literature, there are these categories of architectural knowledge. This distinction between application generic on one hand, application specific, tacit, and explicit. On the tacit architectural knowledge, there is expertise, experience, and skills. On the right side, we can see that this distinction between tacit and explicit is not necessarily a very clear one. For example, you may have goals which are made explicit, or you may have, on the other hand, design rationale which is kept tacit. To manage architectural knowledge, there are two main strategies described by Hansen. You'd have codification. That means your organization is mostly focused on documenting the architectural knowledge in the hope of reusing it later. And the other important strategy is personalization. Basically, your organization is focused on connecting the experts, so that by discussions, by socializing, they can share knowledge. In the academia, there is more focus on the codification part. So most studies were on codification, the so-called intentional codification strategy, which is described in the academia, while in the industry, personalization is widely spread, especially in small and mid-sized organizations. And there is a problem between this gap between intentional codification in the academia and unintentional personalization in the industry. So solving this problem will also be part of my research. As far as previous work goes, in the software architecture field, there is the PhD thesis of Anton Janssen. He described architectural design decisions, which are regarded as an important part of architectural knowledge, and also a recent PhD thesis from Parenforst and de Boer on managing architectural knowledge to support architects and auditors. In the software engineering field, other two important PhD theses are from Dingseuer on knowledge management in software companies. He mostly focused on intranet tools, while Borson focused on software process improvement in learning software organizations. So my overall research problem is to handle test architectural knowledge in software architecture. So this gap, which I already mentioned, between codification and personalization, academia versus industry, there is also this problem of architectural knowledge vaporization, which basically has very nasty consequences, like resulting in, let's say, expensive maintenance or the loss of architectural knowledge. I'm also looking at some practical applications. That would be SOA migrations. Why that? On one hand, SOA is no longer a cutting-edge technology, is getting more and more mature. So basically, it moves from this early stage to being solidified. So I think it gives me opportunities to look at test architectural knowledge. And the overall idea, which I'm thinking, is to actually have these concepts from knowledge management and apply them to the management of architectural knowledge. So I'm defining some research questions. First, I'm interested in the theoretical foundations of test architectural knowledge. I consider that the perspective and the assumptions made about knowledge also influence the perspectives on how to manage it. So I'm interested in looking at the literature and identify these assumptions, this perspective that exists on knowledge, and which, for example, in knowledge management discipline can be different. And also, what is the role of test architectural knowledge when doing such migrations? An early answer to this would be the so-called architectural business cycle from Bass and Clements, where he's actually saying that the architect's experience influences the architecture and consequently the next system to be built. And in turn, a successfully built system adds to the architect's experience. The next research question is, I'm interested in how is architectural knowledge managed in practice. So this would be a more empirical software type of software engineering type of research. So what knowledge management strategies are used? How is test architectural knowledge managed, and what are the involved challenges? The next research question is on measuring test architectural knowledge. As the saying goes, if you cannot measure it, you cannot control it. So I'm interested in using some sort of theoretical framework, because I don't think that picture would be a proper way to measure the tacit knowledge of architects. So the approaches that I want to take for each of these research questions. So for the first one, I'm interested in some sort of systematic literature review on tacit knowledge in software architecture. But still, I'm not really decided on this. Maybe it's a systematic literature review, maybe a mapping study. Should I look in software architecture, or maybe extend it to software engineering? So these are aspects which I'm not decided yet. The next research question, in order to answer it, I'm planning to perform some case studies on architectural knowledge management. So, so far I'm working on a protocol, case study protocol, to perform such case studies. Also, I had some early contacts with some companies and some architects, but it still needs to be followed up. For the third question on measuring tacit architectural knowledge, I identified this theory from Sternberg. This is a famous professor at Yale. He has been studying tacit knowledge for more than 15 years. And I'm thinking he looked at the tacit knowledge of managers and military leaders. So what I'm planning to do is to take this theory and apply it to to measure the tacit knowledge of architects. So just a quick overview of his theory. He's regarding tacit knowledge as having a procedural structure. So tacit knowledge is about know-how. So unlike academic knowledge, which is know that, which is a different type of knowledge, the tacit knowledge has a very practical component. So it's about how to do things. It's also very useful to the architect. He's using it in his activity, for example, when designing a system. And another aspect, it has low support for acquisition. So it's the type of knowledge that you don't find in the books, that most likely you learn it from your own experience. And he's proposing, in order to measure it, to use some situational judgment test. Basically, present some situations to the subject and ask him to rate a series of alternatives. So the approach for that would be to identify some criteria for these scenarios. For example, they need to be from very experienced architects. They need to be from real-world situations. I plan to do that through some interviews. And I would elicit these critical situations and these alternatives. And then I would need to calibrate such a questionnaire. So I would use subjects like students, developers, junior architects, and see if there is any difference when giving such a test to them. But again, this is not a technical test. This is not an IQ test. So it's a more specific sort of questionnaire. I have an early example of a scenario, which is from an interview with an experienced architect. He described a situation where he wanted an organization which had 3 big departments, wanted to migrate to SOA, to implement SOA. But the problem was that each department allocated way too little for the common services. So they allocated something like 10%, while the architect wanted to have half of the budget. So because of this creates a problem, because if you cannot invest in the common part, then getting the benefits of SOA would be very difficult. So the alternatives would be something like, what are you going to do? Should you continue as it is and go with a more reduced set of common services? These are only 2, but of course there are more alternatives, and these would be the subject would rate this on a Likert scale. So highly disagree, somehow agree, and so on. But I still need to contact more architects, get more of these scenarios, calibrate the questionnaire, and see how it goes. I see some risks with each of the research questions. For example, for measuring tacit knowledge of architects, what if the scenarios are not poor? What if I have these scenarios, I present them to various categories, and I don't get anything but statistical noise? So this can happen. For the second question, conducting these case studies would require the collaboration of vendors. So for whatever reason, if these vendors change their mind or they simply don't want to do it, then there will be no case study. So this is an important risk. As far as the first research question, which is more theoretical, I will need to decide on the scope. So because if the scope is too narrow, then the results might not be relevant. If it's too wide, then it might take too much resources. The expected results from the case studies, I would like to get this description of how architectural knowledge is managed in practice. I also want to obtain this methodology for measuring the tacit knowledge of architects. As more practical applications is to understand the role of